Um, Try number 2. I don't think I actually saved the last one. Alright, critical thinking. It's all about the questions. Good questions, bad questions. And there's a lot of judgments, emotional connections listed within the subject of thinking. As soon as people start to talk about thinking, they talk about being rational or emotional or having good thinking or bad thinking, and critical thinking is held up as something that is good thinking as opposed to stinking thinking. But it's such a fuzzy subject. So you guys helped me come up with some really good questions. I will just read through them real quickly. Is there a consistent definition of critical thinking? Is there a cross-cultural definition of critical thinking? Is critical thinking an Anglo-Saxon cultural construct? What stereotypes are there about critical thinking in teaching ESL or EFL? How is teaching critical thinking a language and power issue? And how do we get beyond the stereotypes? In terms of language and power, that will hopefully come clear through this entire thing, but it's because there's so many judgments within it, and the unconscious judgments that teachers and researchers bring to these situations about good thinking and bad thinking, and who can do good thinking and who can do bad thinking. And then there's the whole conceptual imperialism thing, which we'll get to later. Okay, how do we get beyond the stereotypes? Woohoo! Okay, is there a consistent definition of critical thinking? Short answer is no. The definitions vary. They tend to be vague in general, which causes difficulties both in recognizing critical thinking when it's there, or most of the readings that I found were with international students coming into the university system, and they're told how important critical thinking is and that they're going to be expected to do critical thinking, and not told exactly what it is. Okay, so some definitions of critical thinking, and I'm indebted to the readings here. Some define it broadly, and others define it as a collection of traits. It's defined as both a process and a product. Rational thinking, carrying out logical operations, building an argument. A 4-step process analyzing, synthesizing, evaluating, and decision-making. Evaluating the validity of what's being read or experienced. Purposeful thinking about thinking. Questioning and examining assumptions. Is there a cross-cultural definition of critical thinking? And again, I'm indebted to you folks for this. But also, rational thinking, hypothesis forming, curiosity seem to exist across cultures. Traits of critical thinking found in writing of students from cultures that have a stereotype of non-critical thinkers, and international students who took a sociocultural course in critical thinking recognized that they were already doing it, but not by that name. It all depends on the definition of critical thinking, and I've got some interesting variations. Monological versus dialogical critical thinking. And monological is sort of the stereotypical Western logical geometric argument building, but by either finding fallacies in a logical argument or building up an argument piece by piece, very linear piece, trying to prove that your own argument is right and the opposite argument is wrong. So again, it's very linear, individual oriented, in a sense very narrow. So it's stereotypically Anglo-Saxon and Western, whereas dialogical is like dialogue, a more group-oriented thing, uncovering assumptions, discussing, debating them with one another, your own assumptions out there, and it's much more of an equal, group-oriented, social value-oriented, rather than I'm going to win this argument, I'm right, you're wrong kind of thing. Closely connected to dialogical critical thinking is collective critical thinking. I found a couple interesting articles on this. It comes out of the sociocultural tradition of cognition and learning, rather like what we had in SLA with Vygotsky and all his chums. And it's very close to the dialogical thinking. It's built only in this particular author's he was talking about how the whole group goes through the 4-step process, and they all, both the group becomes critical thinkers and the individuals within the group become critical thinkers. So the knowledge is built in two forms at once. Okay. This critical thinking Anglo-Saxon cultural construct. Back in the 1990s, Atkinson wrote an article which really and rightly sparked a lot of controversy about essentially saying that critical thinking is a Western sociocultural context, and that it can't be taught to people from other cultures, and it shouldn't be taught to people from other cultures. There's been a lot of people that have refuted it since then. To look at the issue of whether or not it's a cultural product is much fuzzier. There are the particular style and face of things that we call critical thinking do come out of a Western Greek tradition, and the way that it's taught in university tends to be a very specific way, especially when they're teaching writing and how you're supposed to write an essay and build an argument like that. So there has been, if it's done in the wrong way, it can be seen as sort of something that's being imposed on people from other cultures, and criticizing their own way of thinking and writing and doing things. Going back to the whole Atkinson thing and this stereotype, it goes back to something written by a man named Kaplan back in 1966. He analyzed different rhetorical patterns from different cultures, and this has been translated to think that people from different cultures actually think differently, which has led to a lot of stereotypes, especially people from Asian and Southeast Asian cultures. Seen as passive, used to hierarchical social structures, that they're rote learners and they memorize rather than thinking critically and analyzing, that they won't make arguments, or say critical things in class, and that they're circuitous or digressive thinkers. Of course, once you try and look at the real life situations, that it's much more complicated. The ability to think critically may not be seen because it's being masked by things like problems with the language, problems with particular writing styles. They did this test, a critical thinking test, and half the test was in Chinese and half was in English. And it showed that it really was a language problem. That these concepts need fairly complex language to really be able to work with them. And something I didn't put in here that I should have put in here was that it also, the issues being discussed in critical thinking tend to be ones that relate to what's been going on in Western cultures, like gun control. Whereas if you come from a country where there's strict gun regulations, the whole issue of gun control being controversial is kind of like, it's hard to have a big discussion about it because it's just not an issue. But if you take an issue that's important in this other culture, I think they gave the example of rice imports in Japan, then you can have a very healthy debate discussion because the students are familiar with all in depth with the issue. And as you guys have already said, that students do not match stereotypes, and there's no such thing as all students from one culture being the same. So, okay, and then there's also many different traditions, rhetorical traditions, logical traditions, and students who come from a different rhetorical tradition or argument-building tradition, when they come into a Australian or British thing, the teachers simply don't understand the rhetorical process. Okay, so teaching critical thinking cross-culturally. So one of the things that creates problems is treating people are treated like they can't do critical thinking, or they don't know how to do critical thinking, that there's something wrong with them and they have to sort of be fixed. So that's sort of the conceptual imperialism. We are giving you this wonderful tool. But the other extreme is conceptual relativism, where you look at all the micro differences between people and say this culture's like this culture's like this culture's like this, instead of it emphasizes differences rather than treating it, finding similarities, finding ways to work with it. And I found some great articles about Flinders University program in Australia, where the students were taught about critical thinking in a socio-cultural context, starting with the Greeks and things like that. They were also told what would be expected of them in terms of critical thinking in university work, and then they were able to they could take on board what aspects of it they wanted to use and what aspects of it they feel like they needed to use to be successful students. And they were also interviewed to reflect on how they felt about critical thinking. Was it useful? Was it not useful? Things like that. This is just the tip of the iceberg. This is an enormous subject, and it doesn't even get into the bigger issues of concepts and thinking, perception, all that wonderful stuff. But anyway, it's been interesting. So thank you.